Hello, Jacob Heringman here, talking to you from North Yorkshire where I'm in lockdown, like everybody else. This is the first of what I hope will be a series of short videos, very homespun videos as you can see, in which I'm going to talk about the Renaissance lute, a little bit about its history, its music, with a view, hopefully, to persuading you to spend some of your time in lockdown, taking up a challenge and learning a new instrument. How about the lute? Why not? So where to begin? I thought it might be an idea to concentrate this short episode on a very brief, very general history of the lute, how it got here to Europe, where it came from, and so on. And then in future episodes we'll get on and talk about the music, the tuning, how it's played, and so on and so forth. So for today, this instrument, how did it get here? Well, I suppose the first thing to say is that when we think of the word lute, we think of two distinct things. The word is used generically just to refer to the whole family of plucked instruments. And of course, the plucked instruments have been around in different shapes and sizes throughout history and all around the world. As long as human records exist, people were contriving ways to make plucked instruments, whether they were strung up with a tortoise shell or with a gourd or some sort of hollowed out piece of wood. The lute family of plucked instruments has been around almost forever. But then we have the specific instrument, the European lute like this, which is really the more specific use of the word, and that's the area we're looking at in these videos. Nowadays we talk about the medieval lute, the Renaissance lute, the Baroque lute. This is a Renaissance lute. It's a 16th century instrument. It's really where I'll be focused in these videos, and I hope maybe someone else would like to talk about the medieval lute and about the Baroque lute and so on. So how did it get here? Well, we have to go all the way back to the Middle East in the Middle Ages, where there was a flourishing, very high and sophisticated culture of the lute. In Arabic cultures, the oud being the Arabic word that our word lute is derived from, and our word wood is also a cognate. So you have oud, lute, wood, all closely related. And in most European languages, in fact, the word for lute is, again, derived from the same Arabic root. During the Moorish occupation of Spain, the Middle Eastern lute came to Europe, and by the time that period ended, the lute had already started to evolve into the European lute. So a common ancestor came to Europe. That was the medieval Arabic lute, which diverged into two distinct branches. You had this lute, which first was the medieval lute, then the Renaissance lute, and so on. And you have the Arabic lute of today, which is also evolved from the same ancestor. One very big difference between the European lute and the Arabic lute of today is that the Arabic lute has existed in a continuous tradition since medieval times, whereas the Renaissance lute really had to be reinvented or rediscovered in the last 100 years or so. It died out for quite a period, from the late 18th century for more than 100 years, until a few enthusiastic people took it up again, and then really from the 1950s in a much bigger way. That immediately makes all sorts of differences when you have a reinvented tradition, as it were. So the lute came to Europe. It evolved according to the needs of music and the musicians, and eventually became what we think of as the classic 16th century lute. when it first came to Europe, it was still being played with a plectrum. And the Europeans kept the tradition of using a plectrum. This was a quill plectrum, until around 1500. So if you think about it, when you're playing a plucked instrument with a plectrum or a pick, you're playing single lines of music, or chords, or simple two-part textures. But as music changed, so the requirements of the lute players changed, and by around 1500 they had got rid of the plectrum. That's a historical reenactment of ditching the plectrum. And they started using the flesh of the fingertips. This is in order to be able to play the new styles of polyphonic music. Polyphonic or contrapuntal music, meaning that the music has several melodies that coexist and that vie for attention, as it were, which means you need independent fingers to play these different melodies. So for instance, a two-part texture, two melodies together, difficult to do that with a plectrum. And that's just two voices. Lute music by the 16th century was sometimes 3, 4, 5, or even 6 voices. So that enables the lute to be a solo instrument, although, of course, it continues to be an ensemble instrument too, accompanying the voice, playing together with other lutes or other instruments. But the other big development in the history of music that we need to mention is the invention of music printing in Venice in the early 16th century. With that came a huge explosion of publications of lute music. There were, of course, also many, countless manuscripts of lute music. And these developments enabled the lute to flourish in the 16th century in more or less this form. 6 pairs of strings. I say 6 pairs, the top one is single, the others are double. In the early 16th century, at least, it was very common to tune the bass in octaves like this. So you have these lute books and these lute manuscripts, which have really 3 categories of music for solo lute. You have dances, such as the Italian dance you heard at the beginning of this episode. You have freely composed pieces, sometimes called fantasies or fantasias or ricercars or toccatas. These are pieces that aren't based particularly on pre-existing music, although very often they quote from pre-existing music. And then you have the third category, of which there are probably the largest number of pages devoted, and that is the intabulation, as it's called, which is the arrangement of vocal music for the lute. Now it might seem strange to think about arranging a chanson or a madrigal or some other secular song form, or even a mass or a motet or some other form of church music for solo lute. But if you think about it, this was a way of taking much loved vocal music into a domestic setting. It was the equivalent of the various electronic forms of music reproduction that we have today. I think at this point we'll pause. Next time we'll get more into the different kinds of lute music, how the lute is played, how the lute is tuned, and so on. But for now, I'll say goodbye from sunny North Yorkshire, and I'll see you next time.